Hunger was not an accident in the medieval world. It was a way of life. For the peasants who worked the fields from dawn until dark, hunger arrived every year, as predictably as winter. It crept into cottages when the last of the grain was gone, when the smoke from the hearth thinned to nothing, and when even the rats had vanished from the barns. In those bleak months between harvest and spring, the poor turned not to merchants or markets, they turned to the earth itself. The weeds growing between stones, the leaves by the roadside, the nettles stinging their hands, these became their salvation. To live as a peasant was to live in a fragile rhythm. A good harvest meant survival. A bad one meant despair. A few weeks of rain or a frost at the wrong time could mean months of hunger. There were no reserves, no savings, no safety nets. Food storage was a gamble. A small sack of barley, a few dried beans, a hunk of cheese hardened like stone. When those were gone, all that remained was what nature offered for free. But the earth's charity was wild, bitter, and often dangerous. To eat the wrong plant was to die slowly. To eat nothing was to die sooner. By late winter, the fields that had once been golden with wheat were now barren and gray. The peasants' feet sank into mud where grain had failed to grow. Trees stood bare, their bark stripped in places where desperate hands had torn it away for animal feed. Even the streams ran sluggish with silt, and the fish that once darted through them were long caught. It was then, in that quiet despair, that people began to search for green. Not the lush green of summer, but the fragile shoots that clung to life despite frost. Nettle, sorrel, chickweed, dandelion. Weeds, unwanted by lords and animals alike. But for the poor, they were the difference between life and death. These weeds were gathered with reverence. Peasant women knew them all by sight, which to pluck, which to leave. Their knowledge was ancient, passed through generations not by books, but by stories and scars. A mother might whisper to her daughter as they foraged, "The narrow leaf feeds you, the wide leaf kills you." Children learned early to fear the wrong green, the ones that burned the tongue or numbed the lips. Survival depended not only on luck, but on memory. When the weeds were gathered, they were brought back in baskets, wet from dew, tangled with dirt and roots. Inside the dim cottages, smoke hung thick as a curtain. The hearth fire, fed with scraps of wood and dried dung, burned low. Into a blackened pot went whatever the family could find. A handful of greens, a crust of bread, perhaps a bone left over from weeks ago. Water was added, not clean, but all they had, and the mixture was left to simmer. What emerged was not a feast, but something warm, something that filled the belly and quieted the ache for a little while. This was the origin of peasant soup, not a recipe, but an act of will. Every spoonful was a victory over hunger, a reminder that life, however fragile, refused to yield. There were no spices, no salt, no fat to flavor it. The taste was earthy, bitter, and raw, but it was enough to keep breath in the lungs and strength in the limbs. To the nobles who dined in their halls, the idea of eating weeds would have been laughable, even revolting. Yet, while the wealthy wasted food for sport, it was the peasants' weed soups that sustained the population. They found nutrition in what others trampled underfoot. They made meals from the unwanted, beauty from the forgotten, and hope from the bitter greens of neglect. In the silence of the countryside, you could sometimes hear the faint bubbling of soup pots from cottage to cottage, the same humble melody rising into the cold air. It was not the sound of comfort, but of defiance. Hunger may have been constant, but so was the will to survive. When the stores were empty and the fields bare, the only harvest left was the one that grew wild. The weeds that nobles cursed, the ones trampled beneath hooves and carts. These became the peasant's pantry. Every ditch, every forest edge, every forgotten corner of land was alive with possibility for those who knew where to look. Survival in the medieval world depended not just on strength, but on knowledge, an unwritten science of plants that the poor carried in their minds and hands. Flour was for the wealthy, green was for the desperate, yet in those greens lay hidden gifts: iron, vitamins, warmth. Mothers, grandmothers, and widows knew which weeds could sustain and which could kill. Their eyes could spot edible life among thorns, the rounded leaves of sorrel with their lemon tang, the heart-shaped chickweed soft as silk, the stinging nettles that bit the skin but softened in the pot. A single mistake could mean death, but a single handful could feed a family. In the early morning, before the sun rose over the thatched roofs, women and children went out with baskets made of willow or worn cloth sacks slung over their shoulders. The air was damp with mist, and the ground was cold, but hunger left little room for hesitation. They knelt in fields, along hedges by the banks of creeks, fingers red from the chill, pulling up roots and cutting stems. Their breath rose in thin clouds as they worked, whispering plant names like old prayers. Each plant had its story. The nettle, feared for its sting, was called the poor man's spinach. Boiled long enough, it lost its bite and turned into a rich, dark green broth. Dandelion leaves added bitterness, but strengthened the blood, or so the old wives said. Sorrel, with its sharp taste, brightened even the blandest soup. Chickweed, soft and delicate, was said to heal wounds inside and out. These were not ingredients chosen for flavor. They were chosen for life. Even poisonous plants had lessons. Children were taught early to recognize the deadly signs: milky sap, shiny leaves, the wrong smell. It was knowledge that saved them from death, but it came at a price. Every village had its stories of those who had eaten the wrong thing. A boy who chewed hemlock leaves by mistake. A woman who boiled foxglove, thinking it was nettle. Their names became warnings passed down through generations. The church might have condemned superstition, but in matters of survival, peasants trusted the wisdom of their ancestors. Some believed the weeds had souls, gifts from God for those humble enough to notice them. Before picking, they might whisper a blessing or leave a scrap of bread at the edge of the field. This was not magic. It was gratitude, a recognition of how thin the line was between mercy and starvation. And so, through this hard, sacred knowledge, the poor built a kind of freedom. They did not own the land, but they could still draw sustenance from it. Every leaf, every root gathered was a quiet rebellion against the system that starved them. Nobles ate from the labor of peasants, but peasants ate from the wildness of the world. By midday, their baskets were full, a tangle of greens, roots, and flowers destined for the pot. The sun rose and the frost melted, leaving their fingers stained green and brown. In those hands lay not only food, but centuries of wisdom, a living encyclopedia of the forgotten plants that once kept Europe alive. For the peasants, the wilderness was not an enemy, but an ally, harsh, untamed, but generous in its own way. The weeds that grew from the cracks of despair were, in truth, nature's quiet mercy. To gather food in the medieval countryside was not a simple errand. It was an act of survival, strategy, and sometimes defiance. The peasants' harvest was not bound by fields they owned, for they owned none. It was drawn instead from the edges of a lord's forest, the ditches along the road, and the forgotten strips of common land that still belonged to no one. These narrow margins of the world, places ignored by nobles and priests, were where life persisted for those who had nothing else. On cold mornings, long before the church bells rang, Women and children moved quietly across the landscape. Their eyes scanned the ground for any sign of green, the way a falcon searches for prey. The dew soaked their skirts and feet, but they did not notice. They knew which hollow paths held wild garlic, which shaded slopes hid young nettles, which damp places grew sorrel. This was not wandering. It was memory. Each patch of land was known like a page in a sacred book, but the act of gathering was also dangerous. The forests were often closed, claimed by lords for hunting or timber, and to trespass could mean whipping, imprisonment, or worse. Still, hunger rarely respected boundaries. Peasants risked their lives for handfuls of food the nobles wouldn't even glance at. Many villages whispered the same prayer before stepping into a forbidden wood. May the saints blind their eyes, and the nettles feed our hands. Children were the best foragers, small, quick, and often overlooked by guards. They could crawl through hedges or climb fences unnoticed, returning with arms full of greens. Some even played at it, turning danger into a kind of game. But behind the laughter was fear. The penalty for stealing a lord's weeds was as real as for stealing his grain. Once home, the gathered plants were spread out across rough wooden tables or the dirt floor. The women picked through them carefully, removing stones, worms, and poisonous look-alikes. The air inside the cottage filled with the sharp, green scent of crushed leaves. This was the smell of survival. Mothers scolded children for bruising the herbs too much, or for bringing home useless stems. Every handful mattered. In the best of times, the gathering could even become communal. Families joined forces, trading what they found. One household with nettles for another's wild onions, a few mushrooms for someone's sorrel. In the depths of famine, these exchanges were not generosity but mutual defense, a quiet economy of trust that bound the poor together. Those who shared lived. Those who hoarded starved. Every now and then, fortune smiled. A rabbit snared in the field, a fish caught in a nearby stream. These rare prizes transformed weed soup into something close to a feast. Bones would be cleaned, boiled until they gave up their last taste of meat, and reused for weeks. The peasants called this thickening the broth. It wasn't luxury, just a moment's relief from bitterness. In the stillness of the evening, the day's foraging would end. The light faded, but the cottage hearth began to glow again, smoke curling from the thatch into the cold sky. In the pot, the gathered greens would soon boil, dark and fragrant. The children, exhausted, waited silently as the smell filled the room. Outside, the lords dined in candlelight on venison and bread baked from fine flour. Inside, peasants huddled around their pot of nettles and sorrel, passing a single wooden spoon. But as the firelight flickered on their faces, it was clear who knew the deeper truth of the world, that every leaf, every root, every drop of soup carried the wisdom of endurance. For in that fragile broth simmered something greater than food. It was defiance. It was hope. It was proof that even in hunger, life refused to surrender. The peasant kitchen was not a room. It was a corner of existence, carved from smoke, mud, and necessity. In cottages no bigger than a stable, the hearth was both heart and stomach of the home. It was where warmth met hunger, where the smallest fire kept the darkness at bay. There were no tables piled high with bread or meat, no golden plates, only a soot-blackened pot suspended over a flickering flame. Yet from this meager setting, life itself was sustained. When the foraging was done, the gathered weeds and roots were carried home like treasure. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The single window, if there was one, barely allowed light in. A rough bench, a few clay bowls, a ladle carved from oak. These were the tools of survival. The cooking pot, often passed down through generations, was treated with reverence. It had seen hunger, storms, births, and deaths. It was the witness of centuries of survival. The process began with water, fetched from a well or river, sometimes brown, sometimes bitter. It was poured into the pot and placed above the flame. Into it went the weeds, nettles first, then sorrel, dandelion leaves, chickweed, and whatever else the day had offered. The fire crackled as the mixture began to boil, releasing a green, earthy scent that filled the room. The bubbling sound was a comfort. It meant life, however fragile, continued. There was no salt, no butter, no oil. Flavor came from what scraps could be found: a piece of old bread, a bit of barley flour to thicken the broth, or the brittle remains of a bone saved from a feast months ago. The bone, if they had one, was boiled again and again, until it surrendered every trace of taste. The soup was never clear. It was murky and dark, thickened by roots and faith. This simple weed soup had many names across Europe. In England, it was called pottage, a catch-all term for anything boiled together until edible. In France, soupe maigre, the thin soup often eaten during fasts when meat was forbidden. In Italy, minestra povera, the poor man's soup, made from whatever grew nearby. Different languages, same hunger. The act of cooking was both routine and sacred. Women stirred slowly, watching the greens soften, testing with a wooden spoon as if listening for an answer. Children sat near the fire, waiting for the moment when the ladle would finally rise. Sometimes a few drops of ale were poured in to add warmth. Sometimes, when desperation was great, the water alone had to be enough. There was something ritualistic about it all: the gathering, the boiling, the waiting. It was a rhythm older than any church bell. No one expected pleasure from this food. What mattered was endurance. Each bowl was a promise that another day could be survived, that there would still be someone to tend the fire tomorrow. And yet, even in such harsh simplicity, there was beauty. The steam rising from the pot caught the light like incense in a chapel. The sound of bubbling echoed the heartbeat of the home. The first sip, bitter and hot, was a reminder that the world, though cruel, still offered enough to live. In the castles on the hill, the lords dined on roasted boar and spiced wine, never imagining that the same plants they trampled underfoot were keeping their laborers alive. But below, in the cottages by the fields, the peasants' soup continued to simmer, not just as food, but as quiet defiance. Because in every spoonful of that humble, green broth, there was something greater than nourishment. Proof that even the poorest could create sustenance from nothing, that hope could be boiled from the weeds of despair. What seemed like mere desperation to the wealthy was, in truth, a quiet science among the poor. Peasants were not simply boiling weeds. They were practicing an art refined over generations, a chemistry born of survival. Without books, tools, or training, they had learned to extract nourishment where none seemed to exist. They understood the language of the land in ways that even scholars could not. Every plant, every root, every drop of liquid held meaning. A peasant woman might not read a word, yet she knew that nettles must be boiled twice to lose their sting, that sorrel could sour a broth but revive a weary stomach, that wild onions masked the bitterness of grass roots. Her recipes had no measurements. They lived in instinct and experience. 1 handful of greens, 2 pinches of barley, enough water to quiet the growl of a belly. That was how life continued, through memory, taste, and touch. It was an art born of trial and error, but also of deep observation. Peasants noticed how animals behaved, which plants the sheep avoided, which herbs the goats chewed after illness. They mimicked the natural world, learning from its patterns. When a cow ate a certain weed to ease bloating, the peasants boiled it for their own cramps. When birds picked berries before rain, they took it as a sign of coming storms. Every movement of nature was a kind of scripture written in the dirt. The church fasts played a strange role in this story. Across Europe, people were forbidden to eat meat for nearly half the days of the year. For nobles, that meant lavish meals of fish and eggs. For peasants, it meant their usual fare: broth, bread, and whatever grew wild. Ironically, their poverty made them the most pious without trying. Their soup, made of weeds and roots, fit the rules perfectly. The church called it fasting. The peasants called it life. And while the upper classes turned up their noses at the taste of nettles or chickweed, the peasants were mastering nutrition before the word even existed. Their soups, humble and thin, contained minerals and vitamins that warded off sickness. Garlic, leeks, and onions, used for flavor, also killed parasites. Herbs like thyme and sage strengthened the lungs. Even the bitterness of dandelion leaves helped the liver endure the strain of a meager diet. They had no science to explain it, only faith in what worked. In some villages, the preparation of weed soup was a shared ritual. Women gathered together, comparing what they had found that day, arguing over which herbs to add first. A pinch of mint here, a sprig of rosemary there, a small luxury if one could find it growing by a wall. The fire would crackle beneath the pot as stories were told. Stories of better harvests, of lost loved ones, of the saints who might one day bless their fields. Cooking was not merely sustenance, it was community, memory, and prayer. The pot was never truly empty. Even after supper, a thin layer of broth was left clinging to the bottom. Water was poured in the next morning, and a new day's gathering was added. In this way, the soup never died. It evolved. Some called it everlasting broth. It was a living thing, passed from day to day, fed like a child. It absorbed the history of the household, the rains, the hardships, the brief moments of fortune. And in that fragile cycle, boil, eat, gather, repeat, lay the heart of peasant endurance. They had turned survival into art, hunger into ritual. Their cooking was not a cry of despair, but a hymn of persistence, sung in the language of fire and green leaves. While nobles dined on luxury, the peasants' mastery of simplicity sustained a continent. Their soup was not just food, it was the wisdom of the earth itself, humble, bitter, and profoundly alive. Hunger, in the Middle Ages, was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a weapon. Famine swept across the land like a tide, but its cause was rarely just bad weather. Wars, taxes, tithes, and greed starved the people as surely as any drought. The poor did not always suffer because the land was barren. They suffered because others took what little it gave. And so, the pot of weeds became more than a meal. It became a quiet act of rebellion against a world that hoarded plenty and offered pity instead of bread. A peasant's bowl of soup was a mirror of his place in society. Each spoonful reflected his dependence on forces beyond his control. The Lord's tax, the priest's tithe, the merchant's price. Fields might bloom with grain, yet the peasants who tilled them would starve, for most of the harvest was owed to someone else. When hunger came, it did not strike the rich. It moved through the cottages, the villages, and the unseen corners of the countryside, silent as smoke. And still, the church preached patience. Hunger purifies the soul, some priests said. Suffering brings you closer to God. For peasants, those words rang hollow. They prayed not for salvation, but for supper. Yet even in that injustice, faith did not vanish. It changed shape. The act of boiling a pot of weeds became a prayer in motion, a plea whispered not in Latin, but in the soft bubbling of water and the rustle of green leaves. In monasteries, things were different. Behind their stone walls, monks had gardens, carefully tended plots of herbs and vegetables. They brewed ales and baked bread, feeding travelers and the poor who came begging at the gate. It was charity, but it was also control. The monastery kitchens fed only those who obeyed. The thin broth handed to beggars was both blessing and reminder that even mercy had a master. For the peasants, such charity was bittersweet. To receive food meant survival, but it also meant debt, a moral weight that pressed down as heavily as hunger itself. A man might bow his head for soup one day, then be expected to work the monastery's fields for nothing the next. And yet they came because the hunger never stopped. In those bowls of watery broth, the poor tasted both God's grace and man's power. In some towns, rebellion simmered like soup. Peasants whispered that the Lord's barns were full, while their children starved. A few dared to steal grain, to hunt forbidden game, or to take water from wells meant for the rich. Punishment was swift and brutal. Hands cut off, backs whipped, families driven from their cottages. But for every punishment, there were 10 who risked it again. Hunger makes thieves of saints. Even the weeds themselves carried political meaning. To the nobles they were pests, a sign of neglect. To the peasants they were freedom. No tax collector could claim a nettle. No priest could tithe chickweed. They grew for all and asked nothing. To gather them was to reject the hierarchy that starved the world. And yet, despite all this suffering, peasants still gathered around their pots each night, still shared what little they had, still believed that somehow life was worth fighting for. Theirs was not the loud defiance of swords or banners. It was the quiet defiance of endurance. In that way, every pot of soup was political. Every bowl was a protest, and every sip, however bitter, was a reminder that though the poor were denied everything, they could still take what the wild gave freely, and in doing so feed themselves, their children, and the fragile flame of hope that no lord could extinguish. In a world ruled by scarcity, food was more than sustenance. It was solidarity. The communal pot, simmering over a modest fire, was the center of the peasant universe. In a cottage of rough stone and smoke-stained beams, that bubbling cauldron united all who lived within earshot of its hiss. It was the pulse of the household, the rhythm of survival, and the last refuge of togetherness in a world that offered little else. Evening was when the ritual began. After a day in the fields or the forests, weary villagers returned home with their findings: roots, herbs, weeds, maybe a handful of barley or lentils saved from last season. They pooled their gatherings, knowing that no single family could endure alone. The soup pot in one cottage might serve 3 households, and the next night another family would take its turn. No written law demanded this sharing. Hunger did. Hunger was the law that bound them all. The soup itself told stories: the day's labor, the week's luck, the season's struggle. If the broth was thin, it meant the fields had failed. If the smell was richer than usual, perhaps someone had snared a rabbit or received a bone from the manor kitchen. Every spoonful was history in motion, each meal a fragile victory written in steam. Children sat closest to the fire, their faces glowing in the flickering light, eyes fixed on the pot. They waited in silence as their mothers stirred, not daring to speak for fear of seeming impatient. When at last the ladle rose, it passed from hand to hand. First to the eldest, then to the youngest, then to the rest. There were no separate bowls for each person. Often, One wooden bowl or clay dish served all. A single spoon traveled in circles, each mouthful taken with reverence. It was not etiquette, it was equality. The act of sharing food blurred all lines. In that moment there was no lord or serf, no priest or sinner, only hunger and the small mercy of warmth. The peasants might not have known the word community as we use it now, but they lived it every night. They fed each other because no one else would. Stories flowed as freely as the broth. Tales of saints who fed the hungry, of old men who tricked death, of winters worse than this one. Laughter sometimes rose above the crackle of the fire, soft, weary laughter, but laughter nonetheless. It was a sound of defiance, a refusal to let despair have the final word, and when someone fell ill, the pot became medicine. The same weeds that filled their stomachs also healed their wounds. Nettle broth for fever, garlic soup for strength, sorrel and parsley for cleansing the blood. A spoonful of hot broth pressed to a dying man's lips was both remedy and farewell. The peasants had no physicians, but they had the wisdom of the earth and the compassion of those who knew suffering intimately. The next morning, when the fire was rekindled, the same pot would hang again. Whatever remained from last night became the base for the next, an unbroken thread connecting each meal to the one before. The villagers called it the living pot, and in a way it was. It remembered them. Its blackened iron held the essence of their survival. Smoke, hunger, laughter, tears. This was the heart of peasant life. One pot, one fire, one bowl. From it came nourishment, stories, and hope. In an age of cruelty and hierarchy, that humble soup was democracy in its purest form. Everyone equal before the ladle, everyone human before hunger. And when night fell again over the dark countryside, and the wind howled through the gaps in the thatch, the glow from that single fire told the world one simple truth. The poor were still alive, still sharing, still enduring, one bowl at a time. Centuries have passed since those smoky cottages and their bubbling cauldrons disappeared from the European countryside, yet the spirit of the peasant pot still lingers. Hidden beneath the recipes and cuisines we now call traditional lies the memory of hunger, of resilience, and of the weeds that once kept the poor alive. What nobles once mocked as the food of desperation has quietly become the foundation of regional identity. Soups, stews, and broths that fill our tables today. The famous minestrone of Italy, the pottage of England, the potage aux herbes of France, all trace their lineage to those nameless peasants who learned to make something from nothing. What began as survival became culture. The nettle soups of Scandinavia, the cabbage broths of Eastern Europe, even the rustic farmhouse soups in modern cookbooks, all are echoes of the same story. People enduring hunger by transforming hardship into art. But beyond recipes, the legacy of the peasant pot lives in something deeper, in the very idea of making do. Medieval peasants left behind no monuments, no written chronicles, no portraits in gilded frames. Their legacy was practical, invisible, but enduring. They taught humanity how to adapt, how to use what is available, how to survive when the world turns indifferent. Their wisdom, passed through generations, still whispers through every kitchen that turns waste into nourishment, every cook who refuses to throw away what can still give life. The modern world rarely remembers them. History books speak of kings and wars, cathedrals and inventions. But in truth, civilization was carried through famine not by swords or saints, but by those who kept the pot boiling. When plagues swept across villages, when armies burned the fields, when the earth itself failed to yield, it was the peasants, with their baskets of weeds and their iron pots, who kept humanity from starvation. Even now, if one walks the countryside in early spring, the same weeds grow: nettle, sorrel, chickweed, purslane. To most, they are nuisances, things to be cleared away. But to those who remember, they are monuments of survival. The peasants who once knelt in the mud to gather them were not simply poor. They were scientists of endurance, theologians of hunger, poets of necessity. There is a strange beauty in imagining it: a fire in a thatched cottage, the faint sound of bubbling soup, the faces of a family gathered close against the cold. Outside, power and privilege reigned, but inside, around that pot, there was equality, dignity, and hope. In their own quiet way, the peasants achieved something extraordinary. They proved that life could persist without abundance, that meaning could be found even in struggle, and that nourishment was not merely about food, but about faith. When we eat our soups today, when the steam rises from a bowl of vegetables, herbs, and broth, we are unknowingly tasting history. Not the history of kings, but of countless nameless souls who survived by turning weeds into sustenance. They left no crowns, but they left us this: the knowledge that life, even at its most fragile, can still find warmth, flavor, and endurance in the simplest of things. So the next time a spoon stirs a humble pot, imagine them: the hands that gathered in the rain, the fire that burned low, the family that waited for the first taste. They are still there, in spirit, in every kitchen where necessity meets creation. The medieval peasant's pot never truly went cold. It lives on, in every act of survival, in every bowl of soup, in every reminder that humanity endures not because it conquers, but because it creates.